Have you ever wondered what it feels like to walk alone through a city torn apart by war? What secrets could be hidden in the shadows of Berlin as bombs fall and the night grows darker? Tonight, we take you inside a story of courage, betrayal, and survival. A story so intense it blurs the line between hero and legend. Who is Jonathan Cross, and why did he risk everything to infiltrate the heart of the Reich? Can one man really make a difference in the chaos of a city at war? And what happens when those you trust turn out to be your greatest enemies? Stay with us, because every corner of Berlin hides danger, every alley whispers secrets, and every decision could be a matter of life or death. In this story, you'll witness daring escapes, secret missions, hidden spies, and moments of bravery that defy belief. But only by watching until the end will you discover how the darkest night can lead to a new dawn and the lessons we can take from it. Are you ready to step into the shadows and face the Black Night in Berlin? Berlin, April 1945. The city was burning, shattered, a ghost of what it used to be. Smoke clawed at the sky, turning it a dull gray, while rubble-strewn streets twisted like mazes through destroyed neighborhoods. Somewhere, distant artillery screamed, shaking the walls and rattling bones. Jonathan Cross crouched low behind a crumbling brick wall, rifle pressed to his shoulder, heart hammering like a drum in a funeral march. Every shadow in the dim moonlight was a threat. Every creaking floorboard, a warning. He wiped sweat from his brow, tasting the grit of Berlin on his tongue. This wasn't just another mission. It was the gutsiest, deadliest assignment he'd ever been thrown into. His unit had sent him solo, deep behind enemy lines, to gather intel on a German operation nobody outside Berlin knew about. Rescue missions, sabotage, reconnaissance. Jonathan was stepping straight into the belly of the wolf. A dog barked somewhere in the ruins. He froze. The sound echoed off the shattered walls, bouncing in the empty streets like a gunshot. He counted his breaths, slow and steady, but every instinct screamed to bolt. Jonathan didn't move. He never ran from a fight. Not this time. He inched forward, keeping low, every footstep measured. Broken glass crunched softly under his boots, a tiny betrayal of his presence. He passed overturned cars, street lamps twisted like metal skeletons, and windows staring blankly like the eyes of the dead. Then he saw it. A flicker of light behind a half-collapsed building. A candle? A lamp? Someone waiting? Jonathan pressed himself against the wall, peeking around the corner. 2 German soldiers patrolled, rifles slung casually, laughing in a language he barely understood. But the way they moved, relaxed yet alert, made his skin crawl. He ducked, waited. His fingers danced over the pistol at his hip. Sweat ran into his eyes. This was Berlin's Black Night, a city that had swallowed thousands and was still hungry for more. And tonight, it was hungry for him. Jonathan slipped between the shadows, moving like a ghost. Every corner brought new danger. A collapsed stairwell, a hidden tripwire, the occasional scrap of paper fluttering in the wind, possibly containing codes or instructions he needed to find. Every discovery was a victory. Every misstep could be death. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time didn't exist here. Only the mission. He found the first target, a small office that, according to intelligence, held critical maps of German troop movements and a list of high-value targets. Jonathan picked the lock silently, praying the floorboards didn't betray him. Inside, he found papers scattered like the city outside. Maps, lists, and coded documents. He stuffed them into his bag. His pulse was thunderous. One wrong move, and he wouldn't make it out alive. Suddenly, footsteps above. He froze. Heavy boots. A shadow passed the broken window. Jonathan flattened himself against the wall, holding his breath as the soldiers entered, unaware of the intruder in their midst. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, mercifully, they left. Exhaling silently, Jonathan knew the hardest part wasn't over. Getting the intel was one thing. Escaping Berlin with it while avoiding patrols, snipers, and the ever-present threat of discovery was another. And the night was far from over. This was just the beginning. Berlin's Black Night was long, and Jonathan Cross was walking straight into its heart. Jonathan Cross moved like a shadow through the ruined streets. Every step was calculated, every alley a potential death trap. Berlin at night wasn't just dark, it was alive with danger. Broken glass, twisted metal, the stench of smoke and death filled the air. He checked the documents in his bag again, maps and codes pressed against his chest. The intel could change everything, but it wouldn't mean a thing if he didn't make it out alive. Ahead, he saw movement. 2 German soldiers were patrolling, rifles ready. Jonathan flattened himself against a collapsed wall, holding his breath. The soldiers laughed, but their eyes were sharp, scanning every shadow. He had seconds to act. Sliding silently behind a pile of debris, he waited for the right moment. The soldiers passed, oblivious, and he slipped into a narrow alley, heart pounding. Every creak, Every whisper of the wind felt like a shout. Berlin wasn't just a city, it was a labyrinth. Every street led to another trap. Jonathan knew the Germans had rigged buildings with tripwires, hidden snipers, and patrols that changed constantly. One wrong move, and it would be over. He reached an abandoned warehouse, the next target on his list. According to the intel, it held communication equipment used by German officers. Jonathan needed to get in, download whatever codes he could, and leave before dawn. Inside, darkness swallowed him. He moved carefully, ears straining for the faintest sound. Somewhere above, footsteps echoed. He pressed himself against a beam and listened. The soldiers were talking in low German, unaware of the intruder in their midst. Jonathan crept to the communications room. Wires, radios, and papers littered the floor. He quickly copied the files, snapping pictures with a small camera he carried. Every second felt like minutes, every heartbeat a drum of warning. Then, a sound behind him, a faint click. He froze. A tripwire. His pulse skyrocketed. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his foot and traced the wire back to its trigger. A hidden grenade? A trap to alert the entire patrol? He didn't know, but he disarmed it as silently as he could. Exhaling, he grabbed his bag and slipped out the way he came, hugging the shadows. The night was far from over. Berlin's streets were crawling with danger, and he still had miles to go before he could consider himself safe. Every corner, every shadow, every whisper of the wind could be the last thing he ever saw. But Jonathan Cross kept moving, one step at a time, one shadow at a time, because in Berlin's black night, survival was the only victory that mattered. Jonathan Cross ducked into a narrow alley, chest heaving, ears straining for the slightest sound. The streets of Berlin were a maze of ruin and danger, each corner hiding snipers or patrols. But the intel he'd gathered so far hinted at something bigger, a secret German operation, one that could change the course of the war if captured. He reached the old government building they'd marked on the map. It was half collapsed, but he could see shadows moving inside. German officers, probably guards and clerks trying to protect whatever secrets were hidden there. Jonathan crouched low, thinking fast. He didn't have the luxury of brute force. Every shot he fired would alert the entire district. A small window at street level offered a way in. Jonathan slipped through, landing silently on the dusty floor. The air inside was thick with smoke and the faint metallic smell of blood. Broken furniture, papers scattered like autumn leaves, and the echo of footsteps above told him this place was crawling with danger. He crept toward a room marked Operations. Maps, telegrams, and stacks of coded documents were piled high. Jonathan's hands shook slightly as he began photographing each paper. Every code, every schedule, every troop movement he captured was another step toward saving lives. Suddenly, a voice in German cut through the silence. Jonathan froze, pressed against the wall. Two officers were walking down the hallway, arguing about a patrol schedule. He held his breath, watching shadows dance on the cracked walls. One wrong move, and his mission would end here. Minutes felt like hours. The officers left, finally, and Jonathan exhaled. But he didn't linger. He grabbed a stack of papers, stuffed them into his bag, and retraced his steps. The building seemed alive, every creak a warning, every gust of wind a threat. Outside, the streets were just as dangerous. He darted from shadow to shadow, aware that any patrol could spot him. Any window could hide a sniper. Berlin's black night was relentless. Every step forward was a gamble with death, but Jonathan knew he couldn't stop. Not now. Not with the intel he carried. Somewhere in the ruins of Berlin, lives hung in the balance, and he had the key to saving them or dooming them. As he disappeared into the night, Jonathan realized something chilling. The city was watching him, and every shadow could be his last. Jonathan Cross ran through the streets, heart pounding like a war drum. Every shadow felt alive, every scrap of debris a potential trap. Berlin's black night was relentless, and the city seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning like a labyrinth designed to kill anyone foolish enough to walk it. He ducked behind a destroyed tram, rifle ready, listening. Footsteps. German soldiers, close, scanning the ruins. Jonathan pressed himself flat, barely daring to breathe. One soldier paused, cocking his head, and Jonathan's stomach clenched. If he moved now, it would be over. Seconds dragged. Then, miraculously, the soldiers moved on. Jonathan exhaled slowly, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and kept moving. Each step was calculated, careful, deliberate. His bag was heavy with intel, every document a potential life or death key. A sudden shout rang out. A civilian or a soldier? Jonathan didn't know. He rolled into a narrow alley, barely avoiding a patrol rounding the corner. Gunfire cracked in the distance, another part of Berlin's chaos. He felt the weight of isolation pressing down. He was alone, deep in enemy territory, carrying the secrets of the Reich. He came across a small courtyard, partially covered in rubble. Shadows moved. Two German officers discussing something in hushed German. Jonathan pressed himself against the wall, watching, listening. Their conversation hinted at reinforcements moving to a nearby stronghold. If he didn't move fast, he'd be trapped. Jonathan crept forward, moving like a phantom. Every creak of broken wood, every whisper of wind was a threat. He slipped into a side building, finding a broken stairwell that led to a basement. Down he went, silent, careful, the weight of the mission pressing on him. In the basement, he found old crates, ammunition, radios, and a small cache of documents. He grabbed what he could, stuffing papers into his bag, checking every corner. The tension was suffocating. He could almost feel eyes on him, like the city itself was aware of his intrusion. A sudden noise. Footsteps descending the stairs. Jonathan froze. His hand gripped the pistol. The first officer appeared in the doorway, face twisted in surprise. Jonathan fired a single, precise shot. The officer dropped. Heart racing, Jonathan dashed up the stairs, through the building, and back into the streets. The night was far from over. Every corner could hide death. Every shadow could betray him. But Jonathan kept moving. One step at a time, one shadow at a time, knowing that survival wasn't just about luck. It was about courage, skill, and sheer will. Berlin's Black Night had tested him, and he had survived. But the hardest trials were still ahead. Berlin was burning brighter now. The sky glowed orange from the fires that swallowed whole blocks, and smoke hung thick, choking the city like a living beast. Jonathan Cross moved cautiously through a shattered street, rifle slung over his shoulder, every sense on high alert. Gunfire cracked from nearby buildings. Snipers had the streets pinned, and the occasional scream reminded him that death was closer than ever. But Jonathan couldn't stop. The intel in his bag was priceless. It could change the course of the final days of the war. He ducked behind a destroyed vehicle as a German patrol marched down the street. The soldiers were tense, aware that Allied forces were closing in, but oblivious to the lone American moving like a ghost among the ruins. Jonathan waited, heart pounding, until they passed. Every second felt like an hour. He reached a large plaza, once a bustling city center, now a battlefield, but rubble everywhere, bodies strewn across the cobblestones, fires burning in abandoned cars. He spotted movement, a group of German soldiers escorting a small convoy of prisoners. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Those prisoners could be civilians or resistance fighters, and he had to act. He crawled across the open plaza, using debris and shadows as cover. Every shot fired, every step taken, could betray him. He got close enough to toss a smoke grenade, shrouding the convoy. Chaos erupted. Soldiers shouted, bullets ricocheted off stone and metal. Jonathan used the confusion to slip behind the convoy, cutting the ropes, binding the prisoners. Move, he hissed, guiding them through side streets, avoiding the main roads. The fires reflected off their terrified faces. Some were injured, some too scared to run, but Jonathan pushed them forward, ignoring the burn of exhaustion and fear clawing at his limbs. Suddenly, a group of German reinforcements appeared at the end of the street. Jonathan's mind raced. He could fight them, but the odds were impossible. He grabbed a discarded pistol, fired strategically, and then ducked into a ruined building. The reinforcements hesitated, and Jonathan led the prisoners through a hidden passage he had spotted earlier. They emerged onto a safer street, away from the immediate chaos. Jonathan leaned against a wall, chest heaving, sweat and grime streaking his face. The prisoners looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He didn't have time to rest. Berlin was still a city of shadows, of traps, of death around every corner. The fire in the streets wasn't just literal, it was symbolic. The city was collapsing, and Jonathan Cross was right in the middle of it, carrying secrets, lives, and the weight of a mission that could change everything. But he survived, and that meant he could keep fighting. The hardest part was still ahead. Berlin was a city on fire, both literally and figuratively. Buildings crumbled under relentless artillery, streets ran with debris, and every corner hid danger. Jonathan Cross could hear the distant roar of tanks, the crackle of gunfire, and the terrified cries of civilians. The city had become a battlefield without mercy. He moved quickly through the ruins, keeping low, bag heavy with documents, heart racing. Every street was a gauntlet. Snipers lay in wait, and German patrols had grown more desperate and vicious. Jonathan knew the intel he carried was too valuable for them to let him escape alive. A sudden explosion threw him off his feet. Dust and debris filled the air. He coughed, eyes stinging, but kept moving. The streets were chaos incarnate. Fires roared around him, illuminating silhouettes of soldiers charging, tanks crushing everything in their path. Berlin was collapsing, and he was in the middle of it. Jonathan reached a barricade of burning vehicles and rubble. He peeked through the flames, German officers coordinating a last defensive push. The intel he carried contained their retreat plans and hidden weapons depots. If he could get it to Allied forces, They could end this war faster. But first, he had to survive. He spotted a squad of enemy soldiers moving through a narrow alley ahead. Jonathan gritted his teeth. He couldn't take them head on. He waited, listening. Their footsteps echoed, heavy and deliberate. Timing was everything. One wrong move, and it would be over. Jonathan darted into the shadows, using debris and broken walls as cover. A soldier glanced his way, too close. Jonathan fired a single shot, silent but deadly. The man dropped, and Jonathan sprinted through the alley, heart hammering. He could almost feel the city breathing, watching him, testing him. He reached a ruined courtyard where a group of prisoners was hiding. Jonathan guided them through a side passage, dodging bullets and debris. One prisoner whispered, "You're saving us." Jonathan didn't answer. He didn't have time. Every second counted, and the city's black night wasn't letting up. Suddenly, a German officer appeared, blocking the exit. Jonathan had no choice. He raised his pistol, fired, and the officer went down. The prisoners ran ahead, and Jonathan followed, diving into the shadows of another street. The last stand wasn't just about survival. It was about courage, decisiveness, and sacrifice. Berlin was a city of ghosts, and tonight, Jonathan Cross had to become one of them. As the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, Jonathan paused. The mission wasn't over, but the worst of the chaos behind him, for now. The intel was safe, the prisoners alive, and he had survived Berlin's Black Night, at least for the moment. Jonathan Cross sprinted through the shattered streets, the first light of dawn barely cutting through the smoke and haze. Berlin was a skeleton of its former self. Walls crumbled, streets torn apart, fires still raging. Every step was a gamble, every shadow a threat. The intel in his bag weighed heavily, but the weight of responsibility pressed even harder. Lives hung in the balance, and one misstep could doom them all. He could hear the distant thrum of artillery, closer now, and new German reinforcements were mobilizing. He needed an exit, and fast. Ahead, a collapsed bridge blocked the main route. Jonathan cursed under his breath. There was no going back. Only forward. He spotted a narrow sewer entrance beside a ruined building. A slim chance, but it was all he had. He ushered the prisoners toward it, guiding them as quietly as possible. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. A German patrol had spotted them. Jonathan returned fire, covering the prisoners while dodging bullets. One man stumbled and fell, shouting for help. Jonathan hesitated only for a second, too long, and the man was hit. Jonathan's heart sank, but there was no time to mourn. He dragged the others forward, diving into the sewer just as the patrol closed in. The darkness swallowed them. Rats scurried, water dripped, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. Jonathan led the group through the winding tunnels, every step a silent prayer. The soldiers above were relentless, but the sewers offered a fragile shield. Hours, or maybe minutes later, they emerged into the outskirts of the city. Jonathan paused, chest heaving, sweat and grime streaking his face. Behind him, Berlin was still burning, a city in ruins, a battlefield of shadows and fire. He looked at the prisoners, faces pale but alive, and felt a pang of sorrow for the one they had lost. The mission had been nearly impossible, the risks unimaginable, but they had survived. Jonathan Cross had not only carried the intel, but had also saved lives, even if at a terrible cost. As Allied planes roared overhead, signaling that liberation was near, Jonathan knew one thing. Berlin's Black Night had tested him like nothing else ever could. And though the city had claimed some, it hadn't claimed him. Not yet. He took a deep breath, feeling the first real moment of hope in days. The war wasn't over, but tonight, he had made a difference. And in a world torn apart by fire and shadow, that was enough for now. Berlin was quiet now. The fires had dimmed, the artillery silenced, and the city that had once roared with death and chaos now lay in eerie stillness. Jonathan Cross stood atop a ruined building, looking out over the shattered streets. Smoke still curled from collapsed buildings, and the air was thick with ash. But for the first time in days, he could breathe without the constant weight of imminent danger. The intel he had risked everything to gather was safe. Allied forces were moving on the German positions, armed with knowledge that would shorten the war and save countless lives. Jonathan felt a grim satisfaction. The cost had been high. He thought of the prisoners they had saved, the lives lost, and the shadows of Berlin's Black Night that would haunt him forever. He walked through the empty streets, the silence almost deafening. The city smelled of smoke, blood, and broken dreams. He passed a collapsed building and paused, remembering the men who hadn't made it, the friends lost to a war that had devoured everything in its path. Every corner held a memory, every shadow a warning. As he reached the edge of the city, Allied soldiers waved him over. Relief washed over him, but he didn't celebrate. Not yet. Survival had been a victory, but the memories of Berlin's Black Night were etched deep into his soul. Jonathan knelt beside one of the prisoners he had saved, a young man trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. "We made it," Jonathan said quietly. The man nodded, tears streaking his dirt-covered face. Hope, fragile but real, had survived the night. For Jonathan, the mission had ended, but the war was far from over. He had seen the darkness humanity could sink into, but he had also seen courage, sacrifice, and the resilience of those who refused to give in. Berlin's Black Night had tested him, shaped him, and left scars that would never fully heal. But it had also proven that even in the deepest darkness, one person could make a difference. As the sun rose over the ruined city, Jonathan Cross took a deep breath. The war had changed everything, but he was still standing. And in a world torn apart by fire, shadow, and blood, that was something worth fighting for. Berlin's Black Night was over, but the dawn of a new war, a new hope, had just begun. The first light of dawn barely touched the ruins of Berlin, but Jonathan Cross was already moving. The Black Night had ended, but the city was far from safe. Fires still burned in pockets, smoke curled from collapsed buildings, and the echo of distant artillery reminded him that danger was never far. He had survived the night, saved prisoners, and secured critical intel, but now came the hardest part, getting deeper into the heart of the enemy city. Allied forces were advancing, but the German command centers were still operational, and that's where the real secrets lay. Jonathan's next mission was clear: infiltrate the center of Berlin, gather more intelligence, and ensure the plans in his bag didn't fall into the wrong hands. Every street felt alive, crawling with German soldiers, snipers, and spies. Jonathan hugged the shadows, moving like a ghost through alleys littered with rubble and debris. The weight of the documents in his bag pressed against him, a constant reminder that one mistake could end everything. He passed a collapsed building, memories of the night before flashing in his mind, the prisoners, the gunfire, the narrow escape through the sewers. That night had changed him. He had seen death up close, felt the fear clawing at his chest, and had survived. But Berlin was far from done testing him. Ahead, he spotted movement, figures disappearing into a half-destroyed government office. His intel indicated that this building held communications critical to the German command. Jonathan slowed, pressing himself against the wall, watching. 2 guards patrolled the entrance. One leaned casually against the doorway, smoking, oblivious to the shadows slipping closer. Jonathan's pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed caution. He waited for the right moment, timing his move with the guard's distracted gestures. Sliding silently, he entered the building, the dust and decay swallowing his presence. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burned paper. Broken furniture and scattered documents littered the floor, a treasure trove of enemy secrets. He crouched low, rifling through maps and papers, snapping photos with the small camera in his pocket. Every document could reveal troop movements, secret operations, or hidden caches of weapons. Every second spent here increased the risk, but Jonathan knew the mission could not fail. A sudden noise, a footstep above him, made him freeze. His hand went to his pistol. The shadow of a German officer passed along the cracked floorboards. Jonathan held his breath, heart hammering, waiting until the officer moved on. The tension was suffocating, but he pressed forward, deeper into the building. Hours later, Jonathan emerged onto a street leading closer to the city's center, bag heavier with new intelligence. He paused, scanning the horizon. The real challenge was just beginning. Berlin's heart was still dark, still dangerous, and Jonathan Cross was about to walk straight into the center of the Reich's secrets. He ducked into an alley, catching his breath, and thought about the people counting on him. Every document he carried could save thousands, or doom them if lost. And the closer he got to the city center, the higher the stakes became. The streets grew narrower, the rubble higher, and the shadows deeper. German patrols were more frequent here. Jonathan saw a group of soldiers discussing plans near a destroyed radio tower. He pressed against a wall, waiting, then slipped past them when their attention shifted. Every step was a test of patience, skill, and nerves of steel. Finally, he reached the perimeter of a government compound rumored to house the Reich's top strategists. Guard towers loomed over the ruined courtyard, and searchlights swept across the open areas like hungry predators. Jonathan flattened against the wall, scanning the patrols. One misstep, one wrong glance, and his mission and his life would be over. He waited for the blind spot, then moved fast, low, silent. The sound of broken glass under his boots felt like thunder, but luck was on his side. He slipped inside the compound, the weight of history pressing down on him. Maps, files, and coded communications lined the desks and shelves. Jonathan wasted no time photographing everything he could, memorizing patterns, and copying critical codes. Minutes felt like hours. He could hear voices, footsteps, and the distant rumble of tanks. He knew the Germans would soon notice something was off. Jonathan grabbed the last stack of documents, like stuffing them into his bag. One final glance around the room confirmed he had everything. Exiting the compound was even harder. A patrol appeared unexpectedly. Jonathan fired a single, precise shot, taking one guard down silently. He ducked behind cover as the others scrambled, then slipped through a side exit he had scouted earlier. The night outside was just as dangerous as the day before, but he had the intel, and that was all that mattered. By the time Jonathan reached a safer street near the outskirts of central Berlin, dawn was breaking. He looked back at the smoking ruins, the city that had tested him in every way imaginable. He had survived Berlin's Black Night once, and now he had infiltrated its heart. But he knew the next phase, escaping the city alive and delivering the intel, would push him further than ever before. Jonathan Cross tightened his grip on his bag, took a deep breath, and melted into the shadows. The heart of Berlin had revealed its secrets, but the war was far from over, and he was far from done. Jonathan Cross moved silently through the streets, the morning sun barely piercing the smoke-filled sky. Berlin was a city in ruins, but danger still lingered in every shadow. He had survived the Black Night, infiltrated the heart of the Reich, and gathered critical intelligence, but now he faced a new threat: betrayal. Reports from the resistance hinted that a German double agent had infiltrated their networks. Someone feeding the Nazis information about Allied movements, and possibly about Jonathan himself. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every face could hide a traitor, every handshake a death sentence. He ducked into a ruined cafe, scanning the street outside. Civilians passed by, wary and silent. Jonathan adjusted his bag, checking the documents, codes, and maps he had collected. They were worth more than his weight in gold. But if the double agent knew his location, they were also a death sentence. A shadow moved near the corner. Jonathan tensed. A man stepped into the light, a resistance contact he knew, or so he thought. The man smiled, casual, friendly. "Jonathan," he whispered, "I've got a safe route through the city, but we need to move fast." Jonathan hesitated. Something in the man's eyes didn't sit right, but the mission left him no choice. He followed, staying in the shadows, every step measured, every sense alert. The streets were more dangerous now. Patrols had increased, and the Germans were on high alert after Jonathan's recent raids on their communications. A single wrong move would mean capture, or worse. As they moved deeper into the city, Jonathan noticed subtle signs: doors slightly ajar, shadows that seemed to follow them, whispers just out of earshot. He realized the truth: the man guiding him wasn't entirely trustworthy. A trap could be waiting anywhere. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from a nearby street. The man pulled a pistol, but Jonathan reacted faster, knocking him to the ground. The man looked up, eyes wide, and Jonathan recognized him, the double agent. "You're," the man stammered. "No time," Jonathan hissed. He tied the man's hands with a strip of cloth, dragging him into a ruined alley. "If you want to survive, you'll tell me everything you know." Under Jonathan's intense gaze, the man spilled names, locations, and movements of German spies across the city. The betrayal cut deep, but Jonathan knew he couldn't hesitate. Lives and the success of the mission depended on what he did next. Using the information, Jonathan devised a route to the next target, a hidden depot containing more documents, weapons, and communications gear. He moved fast, shadows swallowing him as the double agent watched silently, knowing his own life was now in Jonathan's hands. Every step through Berlin now felt like walking a razor's edge. Patrols, snipers, hidden traps, all of it threatened to end his mission. But Jonathan pressed on, heart steady, mind focused. The city had tested him before, and it would do so again. By the time he reached the depot, he was ready. Using the intel from the double agent, he bypassed patrols, disarmed traps, and secured the additional documents. Berlin's secrets were now in his hands, but so was the knowledge that betrayal could strike at any moment. Jonathan left the depot, vanishing into the ruined streets. The double agent followed at a distance, cautious, realizing that Jonathan Cross was no ordinary soldier. Berlin's Black Night might have been over, but the game of shadows, betrayal, and survival was far from done. Jonathan Cross moved through the ruined streets of Berlin, the morning sun casting long shadows over crumbling buildings. The city had survived the Black Night, but chaos still reigned. Fires burned in pockets, smoke curled from collapsed structures, and every alley hid danger. He had intel now, more than ever, but the Germans were closing in. The double agent's betrayal had been a warning. Trust no one. Jonathan needed allies, and the resistance was his only option. He ducked into a side street where a small group of resistance fighters waited. Their faces were grim, hands calloused, eyes filled with determination. Jonathan shared the intel from the double agent, and they planned a strike against a nearby German supply depot. The operation would be dangerous. Traps, Patrols and snipers awaited them, but it was necessary. Under the cover of smoke and shadows, Jonathan and the resistance moved through the streets. Broken windows, twisted metal, and the stench of fire surrounded them. Every step was tense, every sound amplified in the ruined city. As they approached the depot, Jonathan spotted a patrol near the entrance. He signaled the resistance, and they ducked behind debris. The patrol passed, oblivious, but a single misstep could alert the entire garrison. Jonathan led the team through a side entrance, using blueprints he had memorized from the intel. Inside, the depot was a maze of crates, documents, and weapons. Jonathan quickly located the target, communications equipment and files detailing German troop movements. As the resistance began dismantling equipment, gunfire erupted outside. The Germans had discovered their presence. Jonathan ducked behind a crate, firing back. The resistance fought fiercely, every shot precise, every move calculated. Explosions shook the building, sending dust and debris flying. Jonathan's heart pounded, adrenaline surging as he led the team deeper, securing the files and sabotaging equipment. Minutes felt like hours. The Germans pressed harder, breaking through barricades, but Jonathan stayed calm. His experience in Berlin's Black Night had taught him patience, precision, and survival. One by one, they fought their way through the depot, carrying what they could, destroying the rest. Finally, Jonathan signaled the retreat. The resistance moved swiftly through hidden alleys, evading patrols and snipers. Outside, Berlin's streets were chaotic, burning cars, collapsed buildings, and the distant roar of artillery, but they made it to a temporary safe house. Breathing heavily, Jonathan examined the documents. They were invaluable. Maps, codes, troop movements, and communication schedules. With these, the Allies could strike with precision, crippling the German defenses in Berlin. Jonathan looked at the resistance fighters, faces smudged with soot and grime, and felt a deep respect. They had risked everything to fight in the shadows of their own city. For the first time, he allowed himself a fleeting sense of hope. Berlin was still a city of fire and shadows, but with the resistance at his side, Jonathan Cross knew they could take the fight further. The heart of the Reich's secrets was within reach, but the danger was far from over. Jonathan Cross had barely caught his breath at the safe house when unease settled over him like a shadow. Something was wrong. The resistance fighters, usually steady and alert, seemed jittery. Whispers darted across the room, eyes flicking to corners, hands brushing against concealed weapons. Then it happened. A hidden door burst open, and one of the trusted fighters lunged at Jonathan with a pistol. The double agent's influence had reached further than he imagined, a betrayal that could have ended everything. Jonathan reacted instantly, knocking the weapon aside and throwing the man to the ground. "Why?" Jonathan growled, voice low and steady. The man's eyes were wild, fear and desperation written across his face. "Orders from the Reich. They said if you survive, everyone dies," he stammered. Jonathan's mind raced. Every second counted. Outside, the distant rumble of German patrols drew closer, alerted by the commotion. They had to move now. Grabbing the intel, he signaled the loyal fighters to follow. The streets of Berlin were a maze of fire, rubble, and lurking death. Shadows twisted with menace, hiding snipers and patrols. Every alley could be a trap. Gunfire erupted behind them. The traitor had tried to stall them, but Jonathan and the remaining resistance fought their way through the chaos. Every corner, every doorway presented a new threat. He made split-second decisions, cover the retreat, neutralize dangers, and keep the intel safe. A patrol appeared at the end of a ruined street. Jonathan dove behind a collapsed tram, firing back as the resistance scrambled for cover. Bullets ricocheted off stone, and smoke from nearby fires filled the air. One fighter went down, and Jonathan dragged him into cover, refusing to leave anyone behind. Through a labyrinth of side streets and collapsed buildings, they pressed on, adrenaline sharpening every movement. The betrayal had shaken trust, but it also honed their focus. Every step had to be exact. One hesitation could mean death. Finally, they reached an abandoned factory on the outskirts of central Berlin. For now, they were safe. Jonathan assessed the situation. The double agent's interference had cost them, but the mission survived. The intel was secure. The loyal fighters remained mostly intact, and Jonathan's resolve had hardened further. Berlin had hurled snipers, traps, and betrayal at him, and he had endured. As the first light of morning touched the ruined city, he knew the next phase would be even more perilous. The heart of Berlin still held secrets, and Jonathan Cross was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. The city's Black Night had tested him once again, but it would not break him. Jonathan Cross moved through the shattered streets of Berlin, the sun now climbing higher, casting long shadows across the ruins. The city was alive with danger. Every corner could hide a sniper, every doorway a trap. But Jonathan had a mission: uncover the Reich's hidden resources before they could be deployed. Using the intel from the double agent and the resistance, he traced a network of secret storage depots scattered across the city. These depots contained weapons, encrypted communications, and documents detailing strategic plans that could prolong the war if left unchecked. The first depot was a half-collapsed warehouse near the river. Jonathan crouched behind a pile of rubble, scanning for patrols. He saw 2 German soldiers entering, rifles slung casually. Timing was everything. Jonathan waited, breath held, and then slipped inside through a broken side door. Inside, crates of weapons and radios stacked high reached the ceiling. Jonathan's eyes scanned quickly. Everything had to be photographed or documented. He moved silently, snapping photos, jotting notes, memorizing codes. Every second counted. Discovery meant certain death. Then he heard footsteps. He froze. A figure emerged from the shadows. A high-ranking German officer, known among the Allied forces for his ruthlessness. The officer's presence immediately raised the stakes. Jonathan ducked behind crates, heart hammering. This was no ordinary patrol. This was a direct threat to the mission. The officer moved through the warehouse, inspecting the stock, oblivious to the shadow watching him. Jonathan waited, calculating his options. Confrontation was dangerous, but escape without the intel was impossible. He devised a plan: create a distraction to draw the officer out while securing the critical documents. Jonathan grabbed a loose crate, tipping it over to crash against the floor. The sound echoed, and the officer's head snapped toward the noise. Taking the moment, Jonathan dashed, grabbing the remaining files and slipping into a side corridor. The officer shouted orders, but Jonathan was already gone, melting into the smoke and shadows of the ruined city. Outside, Berlin's streets were a dangerous maze. Patrols moved methodically, alert from the disturbance. Jonathan led the resistance fighters through a series of hidden passages, debris-laden alleys, and collapsed buildings. The intel was intact, but the pursuit was relentless. Hours passed. Every street was a gamble, every shadow a potential enemy. Jonathan felt the weight of the mission pressing down, but he also felt the surge of determination that had kept him alive through Berlin's blackest nights. By dusk, they reached a safe house near the outskirts of the city. The documents, weapons details, and communications plans were now secure. Jonathan examined the files, realizing the magnitude of what they had uncovered. Plans that could cripple the German defenses and save thousands of lives if delivered to the Allies. Berlin's Black Night was far from over, but tonight, Jonathan Cross had struck a powerful blow against the Reich. And as he gazed over the city, smoldering under the fading sun, he knew the next steps would demand every ounce of courage, skill, and resolve he possessed. The streets of Berlin were a war zone. Fires burned in ruined buildings, smoke drifted through shattered alleys, and the distant rattle of machine guns echoed through the city. Jonathan Cross moved cautiously, his bag heavy with intel, but his mission had shifted: rescue more prisoners before the Germans could execute them. A group of captured resistance fighters was held in a partially collapsed school near the city center. Jonathan crouched behind a pile of rubble, scanning the street. German patrols moved methodically, unaware that a lone American was planning to strike at the heart of their control. He signaled the resistance fighters accompanying him. Timing had to be perfect. Every shot fired, every movement could alert the Germans and doom the prisoners. Jonathan led them through narrow alleys, using debris as cover, inching closer to the school. Suddenly, a patrol rounded the corner. Jonathan reacted instantly, taking precise shots to neutralize the threat before they could raise the alarm. The resistance followed his lead, moving with the precision of soldiers well-trained in urban combat. Inside the school, prisoners huddled, fear etched on their faces. Jonathan moved quickly, cutting ropes and unlocking doors while the resistance covered him. The Germans were not far behind, and every second was precious. Gunfire erupted outside. Jonathan returned fire, covering the prisoners' back escape. Smoke grenades obscured their movements, and the group slipped through a back entrance into an abandoned factory. The fight was fierce. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls, and explosions from nearby fires shook the building. But Jonathan's strategy and calm under pressure kept them alive. One of the prisoners stumbled, injured, and Jonathan dragged him to cover. He didn't have time to think, only act. Each rescued life was a victory, but every moment carried the weight of potential failure. Finally, they reached the outskirts of the city. Safe for now, Jonathan checked the intel and the rescued prisoners. Both were intact. He allowed himself a brief moment to breathe, the adrenaline still pumping, heart racing from the intensity of the firefight. Berlin's streets had tested him, throwing every danger imaginable in his path. But Jonathan Cross had survived, secured critical intelligence, and saved lives. The city was still a battlefield, but tonight they had struck a meaningful blow. As the night fell again over Berlin, Jonathan knew the next mission would push him even further. The Reich's secrets were within reach, but every success came at a cost, and the war was far from over. Jonathan Cross crouched in the shadows, the city's ruins stretching around him. Berlin had been a battlefield for days, but now the mission demanded something even riskier: escape with the intel and the rescued prisoners through the last remaining routes out of the city. The Germans were desperate. Patrols had multiplied, and checkpoints dotted every major street. The main roads were traps waiting to happen. Jonathan consulted the maps and notes from the intelligence files. There was a network of tunnels and abandoned subway lines, a maze beneath the city, that could provide a route to safety. He signaled the resistance fighters. The prisoners followed closely, silent but tense. Every step in the open streets was dangerous. Bullets could fly from anywhere, and snipers had Berlin under watch. Jonathan led them through a series of alleyways, collapsed buildings, and hidden passageways, avoiding the main patrols. They reached the entrance to the tunnels, partially hidden under a ruined apartment building. Jonathan checked the group. Everyone was accounted for, exhausted but alive. He whispered instructions, and they descended into the darkness. The tunnels were claustrophobic and pitch black, damp with the smell of decay. Rats scurried as the group navigated narrow corridors. Jonathan led, rifle ready, ears straining for the sounds of pursuit. Every step was tense. The Germans could discover the entrance at any moment. Suddenly, voices echoed from above. A patrol had spotted the entrance. Jonathan cursed under his breath. He ordered the group deeper into the tunnels, moving as quietly as possible. Bullets struck the walls above, ricocheting with deadly sound. They had minutes to escape before discovery. Hours. Or maybe it felt like hours. Later, they emerged near the outskirts of the city, into a partially cleared safe zone held by Allied forces. Relief washed over the group, but Jonathan didn't relax. The mission wasn't over until the intel reached command. The documents, weapons details, and communications plans were intact. Berlin's Black Knight had tested him and the resistance at every turn, but they had survived. Jonathan allowed himself a brief glance back at the city, smoke still rising, fires still burning, the heart of the Reich in ruins. As they moved toward the Allied lines, Jonathan knew the price of victory had been high. Lives had been risked, some lost, but the intel and the prisoners were safe. The Reich's secrets were now in hands that could turn the tide of the war. The escape was complete, but Jonathan understood that Berlin's shadow would haunt him forever. The war had changed him, but for now he had done what he came to do: survive, fight, and make a difference in a city torn apart by fire and darkness. The outskirts of Berlin were quiet now. Fires had burned out, smoke drifted lazily into the sky, and the streets, once alive with gunfire and chaos, lay eerily still. Jonathan Cross stood at the edge of the city, surveying the ruins that stretched endlessly before him. He had survived Berlin's blackest nights, infiltrated its heart, uncovered secret depots, and led prisoners to safety. The intel he carried had already begun to shift the tides of war. Yet, as adrenaline faded, the true cost of victory pressed down on him. The faces of lost comrades, the sting of betrayal, the heavy weight of survival. The prisoners he had saved lingered nearby, their expressions a fragile mixture of relief and lingering fear. Jonathan walked among them, offering quiet reassurances. Some of the resistance fighters had returned to the shadows, ready to rebuild and fight again. Others, weary and broken, would never be the same. All around, Allied forces moved cautiously into the city. The Germans were retreating, but their shadow remained, walls scarred with gunfire, streets choked with rubble, and the silent presence of those who would never return. Jonathan felt a profound, unshakable sadness, yet he also knew every risk, every sacrifice had mattered. His gaze fell on the documents in his bag, maps, codes, and plans that had been the key to Berlin's secrets. These would be analyzed, used to strike at the Reich's remaining strongholds and save countless lives. For the first time in weeks, Jonathan allowed himself a fleeting, fragile sense of pride. He had made a difference. Night fell over the ruined city, but for Jonathan, a fragile peace had taken hold. Berlin had tested him beyond measure, yet he had emerged alive, battle-scarred, and wiser. The Black Night had ended, giving way to dawn, and with it, a glimmer of hope. As he walked away from the city, Jonathan reflected on the war, the chaos, and the people who had crossed his path. He had seen humanity's darkest depths, but also its capacity for courage and resilience. Berlin would heal, slowly and painfully, yet the memory of the Black Knight and those who had fought within it would never fade. The war was not over, but for Jonathan, this chapter had ended. He had survived, fought, and left his mark on the city's shattered streets. And as the first true rays of morning cut through the lingering smoke, he understood something vital. Even in the deepest darkness, one person's courage could ignite hope, and that hope could change the course of history. Jonathan Cross stood at the edge of the ruined city, the first rays of morning slicing through the lingering smoke. Berlin had been tested by fire, darkness, and betrayal, but it had survived, and so had he. Every alley, every shadow, every choice had left its mark on him, etched deep into his soul. Looking back at the city he had fought through, Jonathan understood something simple yet profound. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite it. Every person he had encountered, every ally, and even those who had betrayed him, had shaped the path to survival and victory. The war had ended, but the lessons remained. Even in the blackest hours, one determined individual can make a difference. One act of bravery, one choice to stand for what is right, can ripple outward, touching countless lives. To those who hear this story, remember, life will test you, and fear will try to hold you back. But courage, compassion, and persistence will always light the way. Don't wait for the world to change. Be the change, even if it feels like you're standing alone in the shadows. Jonathan inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past and the fragile hope for the future. Berlin's black night had passed, and a new dawn was rising, not just over the ruined city, but in every heart willing to fight for what truly matters.